Again, thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual dialogue, lunch and learn series with our own Dr. Ma Vang. But before we do our intro, would like to invite our Chief Diversity Officer, AVC, um, Dr. Danya Matos.
Thank you, Onar, and thank you everyone for being us. A special thank you for Dr. Vang. I also want to just acknowledge this moment. It wasn't intentional in design, but I'm glad we could be together as a community. You know, I teach race and the juridical history and legal history of the United States, and there is no way to teach that without also recognizing the racist history and exclusionary history of our Asian American and Pacific Islander community. And so to understand the current tragedy of the racist violence against them is also to recognize that it's a product of that history, right? And then when we think about race and racism and its intentional design, its intentional solution is also with that deliberateness that we must bring to this. And so we come together just in solidarity, not only to stop Asian American and Pacific Islander hate, but to stop the domestic terrorism that fuels that hate. And so with that, I just wanted to take a brief moment to acknowledge that we're currently sort of developing more along those lines, but I thought it was important to acknowledge what's happening in the larger context of it and to show our solidarity and support. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Onar. Onar, there was a quick note about low volume too, so I just wanted to put that up for you. And thank you again to all of you for being here.
Okay, I think my volume is all the way up on my end, and is it coming through?
We're still having some trouble hearing you, Onar. It sounds really far away on our end.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll move closer.
Mhm.
Is that working?
I don't think so. Yeah, I think people are still saying that it sounds like you're whispering, perhaps. It just sounds really low.
Okay.
Let's see.
Let me do this. How about this?
It's definitely better.
Okay, great. All right. Hopefully it'll solve itself. But again, thank you. Yes.
We're good. Yeah.
Okay.
It came back.
Okay. Thank you. Again, thank you for sharing space with us. Again, wanting to share with you the current incident that occurred in Atlanta. We had an incident of a hate crime totaling of 8 victims murdered, and 6 of them were of Asian descent. I wanted to take a moment of silence, a moment of reflection for all the victims of hate, and also just for us to think about how the media or coverage or lack thereof, and also how the treatment of the assailant is being handled. While we are in a moment of silence and a moment of reflection, I want to share with you a quote by Yuri Kochiyama, one of my favorite folks in fight for equity and justice and social movement. Yuri shares, people in the movement sustain each other. It is because their spirit is so contagious. So I lead you with that. And if we could have a moment of silence, that would be great. Again, thank you. Right. Kind of getting the feels. I am with you all, and thank you again for coming. And also want to reiterate our commitment to equity and justice as the OEDI office will continue to provide resources through our website and provide some communication as we support the API community, POC communities that are being impacted during these times. Before introducing our special guest, wanting to read our land and labor acknowledgement for UC Merced. Local indigenous people, including the Yokuts and Miwok, who understand the earth as a place for everyone, first inhabited the land where UC Merced is located. When we address diversity on this campus, we do so boldly, daring to look forward and backwards, imagining diversity's demand for the 21st century and the importance of diversity and addressing past wrongs, reaffirming humanity, and ensuring reconciliatory path of redress for the future. The most prominent path of our campus is called Scholars Lane. By day, you can see and hear and witness the embodiment of our diversity through our campus community members making their way across campus, framed by the slopes and peaks of the Sierra Nevada. And part of our series is always acknowledging the land and labor acknowledgement. And the two reflection questions that we challenge folks in the space is, what intentions do you have to disrupt and dismantle colonialism beyond this land acknowledgement? What is your organization doing beyond acknowledging those land and labor allow you to live, work, and or learn in this space? So as we move forward, as Dr. Ma Vang will share her book, just think about those two questions throughout. So it is my pleasure to introduce our special guest, Dr. Ma Vang. Dr. Ma Vang is an assistant professor and founding chair of the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Merced. Her book, History on the Run, Secrecy, Fugitivity, and Hmong Refugee Epistemology, examines how secrecy structures both official knowledge and refugee epistemology about militarism and forced migration. She is the co-editor of Claiming Place on the Agency of Hmong Women, University of Minnesota Press, and her writings that have been published in Positions, Asia Critique, MELUS, and Critical Ethnic Studies Journal. Dr. Ma Vang has received several awards to support her research, most recently the UC Multi-Campus Research Collaborative Grant and the Whitting Foundation Public Engagement Grant. Dr. Ma Vang serves as co-editor of the Critical Refugee Studies Collective website, with which hosts the Refugee Archive and Story Map platforms for refugees to share stories. Dr. Ma Vang is organizing the Refugee Teaching Institute in summer 2021 to engage with students and community members as teachers for K-12 ethnic studies curriculum and training. So I introduce to you Dr. Ma Vang as she shares this exciting book. And at the end, we will have an opportunity to make comments, ask questions, and yeah, so I turn it over to you, Dr. Ma Vang. And again, thank you for this space.
Thank you, Onar. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to share this space with you. I want to thank Onar Primitivo and ABC Dania Matos for their kind invitation to share my book with the UC Merced community. And because we have been in a pandemic, I also consider this a virtual book celebration, so yay. And thank you everyone for joining today. Although, I am excited to share with you insights from the book, which, I have History in the Run as the title of my talk today, and then Hmong American State Violence and Accomplishment, to sort of go over the key arguments from my book and then apply that to think about what's happening in our context today. But today I'm also enraged, right, as Dania and Onar have opened up the session for us with acknowledgement and a moment of silence for the killings in Atlanta. 8 people have died. 6 of them are Asian American women. And even though officials have not called it or refused to call it hate crime, we see it for what it is, the ongoing violence of white supremacy. And in a pandemic in which the coronavirus has already disproportionately killed more Black, Latinx, and Indigenous peoples, where we've witnessed more and ongoing police murders of Black folks, where over 3,000 hate crimes have been reported against Asian Pacific Islander Americans because our former president deployed racist language to link the virus to Chinese and Asian people, right? I'm just exhausted today, which I'm sure all of you are as well. And part of the news reporting about the murders cite that the perpetrator had a sex addiction, with one New York Times article citing that the neighborhood where the 2 of the 3 spas were located was considered its red light district, right? So the reports then also praised the response of law enforcement, and that officials refused to call it racially motivated violence is not about them taking precautions. It is about the upholding of policing and white supremacy that operates through racial, gendered, and sexualized logics, and it is killing our communities, right? So these women are not sex workers, right? But they have been sexualized as such. So I just want to quote one of my colleagues who says, "Fuck the police and fund sex workers." End quote. Okay, so I am an ethnic studies scholar studying refugee history, culture, and humanity at the intersections of war and colonial violence, gender, race, and power. In short, I interrogate state violence, how it has always been racialized, and how it links the oppressions of Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer, trans, disabled communities, literally all of our oppressions. And in doing so, I'm most interested in finding our connections through solidarity, being accomplices for each other and loving each other because the state and institutions do not love us, right? So therefore, the knowledge base and cosmological perspectives of historically displaced peoples and marginalized communities more broadly lie at the core of how I orient my research, teaching, mentorship, service, and diversity contributions. 2 inquiries I often ask myself and my students are, how do we know what we know? And how do we trace power rather than mainly collecting data on oppression? What do we do with all of this violence, right? Ongoing violence that we have. And how do we trace how power operates so that we can, form solidarities, right? My research contributes to rethinking the refugee beyond its legal definition outlined in the UN Convention on Refugees in 1951, right? For which it says that refugees are those who have been persecuted and are fearful of returning. I attend to the social, political, and cultural layers of the refugee as a critical idea and a social actor whose history, culture, and humanity exceed the dehumanizing framings of nation state and human rights regimes, such that refugee life illuminates the interconnections of colonization, war, and global political economic regimes. This reconceptualizing of the refugee as a figure in my scholarship establishes the refugee as a site of knowledge, rather than treating the refugee as either an object of rescue or a protected legal status that further excludes a wide range of displaced populations from seeking asylum, right? The legal refugee category also excludes those who may experience violence from gaining protection, right? So I argue that we must believe the stories of those who are forcibly displaced. There's often groups seeking asylum for racialized, gendered, and or sexual violence, as well as the effects of global racial capitalism and environmental destruction that do not fit the narrow framing of this refugee designation. And importantly for today's discussion, my research intervenes in Hmong historiography and subject formation. So if you encountered any information about Hmong people or history, you might have seen or read Anne Fadiman's book, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, which is about a Hmong family Merced in the 80s, right? I don't recommend it unless you want to read it to critique it. And I can talk more about that later. Fadiman's book and other existing scholarship or even popular stories, we can see TV shows, TV representations or media representations in TV shows like House and Grey's Anatomy, which talk about, you know, race and health and use Hmong families as an example of sort of the ways in which medicine, you know, different communities cannot understand Western medicine, right? They deployed racial colonial tropes of uncivilized or non-compliant to describe Hmong ontology. They pathologize Hmong history, culture, and subjectivity as being stranded in the past, without understanding how structures of US militarized empire and racial violence produce these ideologies. So today, I want to first introduce you to the ideas of Hmong fugitive history and soldiering to show that Hmong soldiering for the US was a form of colonial violence. So that's the key arguments from the book. And then I want to move to thinking about contemporary issues of racial state violence, in particular how state violence connects the experiences of Hmong Americans, and by extension that of refugees and Asian Americans to those of Black Americans and the movement for Black lives. So I'll spend the latter part discussing the police murder of George Floyd by 4 Minneapolis police officers, one of whom is Hmong American. As I argue in the book, Hmong refugee history is oriented around having to be on the run as an act and an epistemic assertion to maneuver colonialism, militarism, and state violence and erasures. Hmong were forcibly displaced across the different geopolitical boundaries of China and Southeast Asia, right? So that's including Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, and Burma, under the overlapping Chinese, French, Japanese, and US imperial powers. This inter-imperial history meant that Hmong have had to navigate the relationship to imperial rule and state governance to insist on their sovereignty and self-determination. Hmong resistance to imperial and state governance also informed their complicated relationship to state violence, at times as an ally. So in Laos, from where the Hmong American population was displaced, Hmong resistance to French imperialism and US liberal militarized empire also constituted dissent against the Lao monarchy and anti-colonial leaders who were sympathetic to these imperial powers. So during the Secret War, Hmong were recruited to ally with the US to aid its imperialist war in Vietnam to stop communism. Thousands followed or were coursed to join the right-wing Hmong leader, General Vang, who was recruited by the US via the CIA to engage in the largest clandestine military operation of its history. So this is on my left, probably your right, is an image of General Vang Pao, and then the image of the first 300 Hmong recruits by the CIA. This is an image from their training in 1960, right, to fight the war in Laos. The US government's recruitment of proxy soldiers among Hmong people to disguise its violation of the 1954 and then eventually the 1962 Geneva Conventions constituted the war secrecy, right? So after the French defeat in Vietnam, the 1954 Geneva Convention stipulated that there would be no foreign military intervention into the former French colonies of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And so the US intervention was a violation of this international mandate. And so to circumvent it, they instead recruited people who, ethnic and indigenous people who lived in Laos, right? And Hmong was one of them. So the CIA's secret army, which included Hmong people, but also Mien, Khmer, Kha, and Lao peoples, peaked at more than 30,000 soldiers and operated in northeastern Laos to combat North Vietnamese troops operating in the region. This army aided the US covert bombing missions on communist Lao bases to intercept the North Vietnamese army supply route, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran through eastern Laos. Flying these bombing missions were American pilots who were discharged and re-enrolled as volunteers, Thai pilots, and eventually Hmong pilots. They dropped more than 270 million bombs, amounting to 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos. In all, the secret army provided intelligence, engaged in armed combat, and rescued American pilots, dead or alive, flew bombing missions, and took part in various other military duties. In essence, they were the new friends of freedom in relation to the racialized North Vietnamese army. So this is as you can see, secret because it was previously classified. This is a CIA document, and this is an image of Laos, and the enlargement is and you still can't really see it, but that's where the secret military base was. Yet this new friend status did not negate Hmong as racial others. Hmong soldiering for the US established a colonial ally relationship grounded in the project of modernization. Indeed, the colonial trope of Hmong having not yet emerged in modernity racialized this group as being at a time and space because they do not have a country, right? And soldiering as a nation building project aimed to enfold Hmong into the Lao state and colonial modernity. The post-colonial Cold War conflict capitalized on Hmong soldiering to disrupt Laotian decolonization and undermine Hmong political movements for sovereignty. So while Hmong soldiers who were later displaced as refugees were an ally to state violence, Hmong soldiering was a complicated history that continues to teach us about the work of militarized imperial power and its connections to domestic racist policing. And Hmong allyship with the US military imperialism led to their forced displacement, where after fleeing to refugee camps, tens of thousands eventually relocated to the US. And according to a 2017 American Community Survey, there's an estimated population of 309 with over 96,000 in California alone. So Hmong soldiering as an ally to state violence is hidden by the fact that it was under secrecy, right? It was operated under secrecy. Thus, Hmong refugee history is as much about soldiering as it has been about structural eradication within US history and from the American imagination through war and militarism, where Hmong Americans have been effaced by US imperialism and racism. This effacement has enabled Hmong American experiences of racial violence to be evidence for conflating or dispelling the model minority myth. So I contend that Hmong erasure reveals how the model minority myth has always been used to enact state violence. So how has Hmong history been erased and made fugitive? Let's take a look at the story cloth, one of the most well-known Hmong refugee cultural products to record Hmong experiences during and after the war. I view this story cloth, which is called Pandao. It's an embroidered embroidery as a map, right? That shows a longer historical pattern of Hmong migration to counter the perception about Hmong as a people that's at a time and place, right, on the one hand, and whose historical emergence is only tied to their displacement as refugees. So this contradiction, highlights a larger conundrum. the forced migration of a people who already do not have a country through a historical event that was not supposed to exist, right? Because it was made secret. So this Hmong textile and representation of oral traditions as a map shows movement without consolidating into a narrative about geopolitical borders. So this is one of the most sort of well-known story cloths. In 1996, Dia Cha, Hmong anthropologist, published a short book, Story Cloth, The Hmong People's Journey of Freedom, in which she presents this story cloth stitched by her aunt and uncle in one of Thailand's refugee camps, and then they sent it to her. So Cha mentions in her narrative that her mother had destroyed all the documents they had relating to her father's involvement in the war. So they didn't have anything to prove her father was actually fighting on the side of the Americans. But when they got to the camps, one of her father's friends gave them a photo of her father taken at the front lines. And since Hmong families destroyed important documents that evidenced their involvement in the US, with the US, and CIA records were either kept secret or redacted, they did not reveal much. The story cloth as a form offers textile archive created by the refugees to depict their patterns of migration that were intertwined with histories of colonialism, war, and violence. Because the story cloths depict the escape from communist persecution and refugee resettlement, they poignantly situate Hmong forced migration from Laos as a part of a longer history of fugitivity. So I just want to point to what the story cloth does, which is to document this history, right, of forced migration from China into Laos, you know, the L is for Longcheng, and then forced migration across the Mekong River into Thailand, onto planes to the US, right? And so it provides a Hmong narrative to what has been always erased in the US narrative, right, about its involvement in Laos. So this is a congressional briefing to President John F. Kennedy in 1962. It's a 2-page document about what was happening in Laos, and you can see that it is heavily redacted, right? So this is one of the first documents that I encountered as I was doing research, which led me to question and think about and theorize what secrecy means, right? And these documents have since been declassified and made available. And so in that process, they became redacted, right? So the story cloth represents the remnants and stories one is left to grapple with. And in short, the histories that run, because they are carried by people who are on the run. History on the run, the central concept I develop in the book, names Hmong on the run as an episteme, one that is fugitive because it eludes traditional archiving, yet it tracks the presence of Hmong refugee epistemologies. Refugee epistemologies are ways of knowing embedded in stories, Hmong cosmology, and cultural productions like the story cloth. So the story cloth illuminates the refugee as an artifact of US liberal militarized empire and state governance is also a subject of secrecy whose absence in the archives demonstrates record keeping as one form of violence, right? This is a form of violence. The incomplete and missing records, absenting of violence, poses a danger for accounts of Hmong refugee migration because they can only chart the secret or as the origin of Hmong refugee histories. Okay. So with this framing of the book, I want to move to sort of think about contemporary issues. I mean, in the book, I also talk about contemporary issues, but I think that this will be helpful for us today. So, you know, and I discussed in this last part of the talk how Hmong exposed the messiness of race relations in the US due to their implication as a US ally in the post-colonial Cold War struggles in Southeast Asia. Bridging insights from critical refugee studies and critical ethnic studies, Kit Myers and I recently wrote an essay on Tou Thao, the Hmong American officer and his involvement in George Floyd's murder, in which we argued that Thao can be a state-sanctioned murderer. In fact, he was called to do so through the convergence of US police and imperialist structures that demanded his active silence as a new friend of freedom. This new friend is embodied in the figure of the Hmong soldier who became a refugee after the war and whose supposed lack of self-determination justifies not only the violence of US empire and policing, but also facilitates participation in those very acts of violence. So, and then important, I also show how Hmong American activists refuse this reprised role of the ally, insisting on justice for Floyd and other Black people killed by the police. So as you know, Floyd's killing was the third in a string of highly public deaths since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, following that of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. I won't rehearse the horrid details of Floyd's death, but as we all witnessed on various media outlets, 4 police officers, right? One of whom knelt on his neck, pressed on his neck. And we saw in eyewitness cameras the 2 additional officers holding him. Additionally, the body camera video of Tou Thao, a Hmong American officer, showed him interacting with witnesses and yelling at one point, quote, "This is why you don't do drugs, kids," right, end quote. He and the other officers did not intervene, right? So exposing how state violence operates through militarism and policing can show the complex intersections of Black American and Hmong American experiences, yet they're not commiserable. Thao's positionality as an officer parallels local and national efforts to diversify the police force and serve the community he represents. Nonetheless, he operates within the white supremacist police state. Thao's recruitment and work as a Minneapolis police officer is consistent with US imperialist practices to recruit Hmong as proxy soldiers during the secret war. Reaction from the Hmong community to Floyd's murder was mixed and complex. Many understood what had happened to Floyd was wrong, and it reminded them of Vang, the Hmong teenager who was shot and killed by Minneapolis police in 2006. And the officer who shot him was acquitted of all charges. Yet many were also saddened by the destruction of their neighborhoods or businesses in the aftermath of the quote unquote looting, right? Although it was clear that some of the destruction was incited by white supremacist agitators who sought to undermine the peaceful protests, the destruction of Hmong-owned businesses was a second blow to the discrimination they encountered as a result of COVID-19 anti-Asian racism. Hmong American writer and activist Vang's poem, "To all the Uncle Taos out there, I see you, I hear you," exposed the problems of how Hmong masculinity and patriarchy are tied to US imperialism and policing. The poem addresses the aftermath of Floyd's murder and Hmong men's outrage at being scapegoated, especially the internet trolls who expressed anti-Black sentiments and threatened Hmong American women, queer, and trans folks for speaking out against Tou Thao. By addressing problematic Hmong men ubiquitously as Tou, the poem names Thao and his violence, but also links it to his supporters and how their defense of him become alibis for patriarchal and state violence. So I'm just gonna lead this up. This is a stanza from the poem. The poem's direct address of Tao's inactions to stop Chauvin, quote unquote, "because your commitment to your brothers in combat is greater than your humanity," compares it to the dangerous brotherhood that exists within the institutions of policing and militarism, as well as the patriarchy of domestic violence. Such brotherhoods uphold the racist and gendered institutions rather than stand for human life and dignity, because to, quote, fight for the Black man at your feet begging to breathe would make you a traitor, end quote. Ultimately, Hmong men's outrage at the injustice of Vang is not enough to make visible the intersections of Hmong and Black life. Hmong American women's critiques of the deployment of Hmong patriarchy to bolster US imperialism and racism reveal the encompassing logic of white supremacy in which anti-Blackness is embedded in Hmong soldiering and policing, showing how Hmong state allyship did not necessarily end with the conclusion of the war. So the history of Hmong soldiering for the US reveals the high costs of doing the work of state violence, that the vast majority of Americans trust the institutions of military and police upholds these institutions as humane. Indeed, the narrative that US militarism brings protection, democracy, and freedom rather than aggression, violence, and death parallels similar claims of US domestic policing. When the US hit 70,000 coronavirus-related deaths, US media proclaimed that we had surpassed the death toll of the Vietnam War. The universal focus on US deaths demonstrated the devaluing of non-American lives lost, erased the approximately 3 million of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians, and more than 30,000 Hmong soldiers, plus 1/3 of the total Hmong population, who died due to the war. So in this way, Hmong were recruited to fight for freedom and democracy abroad, yet similar to African Americans after World War II, and really after all the US wars, right? They were ostracized, neglected, and criminalized upon arrival in the US. Hmong, along with other Southeast Asian refugees, resettled in the same low-income neighborhoods as Black and Latinx communities after their arrival. Limited economic and social resources created by failed US refugee policies and the eventual dismantling of the welfare state engendered anti-Hmong and anti-Asian sentiments, not only from broader public, but also from African Americans and other marginalized communities, even as prominent Black leaders supported refugee resettlement, right? And at the same time, historical white supremacist logics and structures perpetuated anti-Black sentiments within the Hmong community. So, you know, sort of highlighting all of the intersections of what's going on. Doing the work for the state as soldiers did not save Hmong refugees once they came to the US. It merely produced further costs in addition to the lives lost, families separated, and trauma experienced. Ethnic studies scholar Bao Lo explains that young Hmong and Southeast Asian American men experience criminalization regularly through police harassment and surveillance in their neighborhood schools. Yet it has been difficult to parse out this statistical prevalence of Hmong criminalization due to a combination of the invisibility in the AAPI prisoner population as a public issue and of aggregated data that lumps Hmong within Asian, Pacific Islander, and other categories. For AAPIs, criminalization occurs in the process of school to prison to deportation pipeline, where there are 250% growth as the prison population in the 1990s reveals that Southeast Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have higher rates of arrest and incarceration. Southeast Asian Americans are 3 to 4 times more likely to be deported for old convictions for which they have already served time. So Lo's study of high school Hmong youth shows that they commonly experience police harassment for the purpose of identifying gang membership. One student revealed, and I quote, "The police told us that if we should ever do something, then everything we do will be gang related. This gets carried with us forever," end quote. So rather than seeing Hmong and Black racial formations as separate, a relational interrogation of the intersections of Afro-Asian experiences and oppressions illuminates the links between state violence and policing and militarism. In particular, as Janelle K. Hope explains, many Hmong and Southeast Asians carry with them explicit experiences of state-sanctioned violence and militarism. Hope, who examines emergent Southeast Asian solidarities in South Sacramento, following the police murders of Stephon Clark and Daryl Richards, urges Asian Americans to see themselves in Black people and their struggles. The sense of distance between Hmong and Southeast Asian communities from Black communities is not always present, she argues. Although there is a level of incommensurability, shared experiences of state-sanctioned violence and of living together in impoverished and segregated neighborhoods informs the possibilities of such solidarities. So Hope calls for accompliship rather than allyship, right? The allyship that Tao lent to his fellow officers, right? Accompliship, quote, and I quote, recognizes that standing in solidarity with oppressed people is in some cases a criminal act. Accompliship always necessitates risk and abandonment of self-interest for the sake of collective liberation and justice, end quote. The formulation of accompliship is different than the form that Tao lent, right, to white supremacist policing. So together, Hmong Americans and Asian Americans must heed Hope's call for accompliship in relation to the movement for Black lives. This means continuing the ongoing work, right, of Afro-Asian solidarity by taking collective action toward abolishing police and prisons, even in the wake of increased recent anti-Asian violence, as well as humanizing and valuing Black lives. How do we imagine different structures, different relations, and different ways to produce security and safety that do not rely on white supremacist institutions and logics? Is it not enough to just be not racist, right? Or to understand the intersections of oppression? It takes collective acknowledgement that the dehumanization and expendability of life are the keystone of the US police, capitalist, and imperialist state that was built on conquest and slavery. This means that Hmong communities refuse white supremacist logics, discard their refugee gratitude to the US, and that Hmong men in particular shed their colonized loyalty and investments in patriarchy that produce anti-Blackness. It requires enacting intersectional organizing to situate racism within the physical violence of everyday culture and public policies, and depending on systems of mutual aid that uplifts our collective humanity. So I want to end with a quote from Yua Lee, the mother of Feng Lee, the Hmong young man who was killed by Minneapolis police in 2006. So on May 31st, 2020, Lee, who was 59, along with hundreds of other individuals from the Hmong community, attended a Justice for George Floyd protest. She expressed her pain as a mother who had lost her son to police murder and urged her community to stand on the side of justice. And I quote, "I know that there's nothing else in this life to assuage my pain at all. I saw that when it was my son, Fong, Black people aligned with us. It didn't matter day or night, they were with us all the time. This police murder is what hurts the most. We must join them." End quote. And then in a June 4th, 2020 virtual discussion, she later explained what she saw in the video footage of her son's murder. And I quote, "In that moment, I knew my child had surrendered 100% with his hands raised, and they shot both his hands to pieces. Right after they shot him, it looked like the video was cut because the next moment showed a gun next to his body where they planted it. This was something that showed that they, the police, can take away our lives because they do not see us as valuable people." End quote. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Dr. Vang, for this. just amazing, amazing book. As I think in our communication, I'm on the part of the secrecy section of the book. But yeah, I just really want to open it up for comments to the group or questions. If anybody is willing to unmute and share your comment or question to the group, we will unmute you all. But again, thank you. If there's no question, I do have a comment for you, Dr. Vang, as I shared in our communication, as it relates to the beginning of the book. Or you can raise your hand, type your question in the chat. Denise, did you?
Sure, I'm going on video.
Awesome.
So thank you, Onar, for presenting this, introducing Dr. Vang. That was wonderful. I really was really enlightening and informative. And my question is related to some of the work that you're doing with high school education. And so how kind of the action question, if you can talk about how do we change that? How do the words that you and the questions that you ask of your students and of yourself, how does that become more pervasive in pedagogy and in teaching at a younger age? Because I think to really deal with white supremacy and deal with the way people think about history.
Thanks so much for joining and listening and for that question, Denise. Yeah, I think that's why I think that one issue is the institution of education, specifically the K through 12 education that has really upheld, right, Eurocentric. I mean, even university education continues to do that. Knowledge and doesn't, and the way in which it's doing the school to prison pipeline, right? And so how do we how do we bring these, and typically students don't get introduced to ethnic studies education until they get to college, right? And depending on where they go and if there are coursework, or education on race, right, and power. And so I think that with the move, and I hope it'll pass soon by the California legislature to require ethnic studies as a graduation requirement for high school students, that we can do this work more in at the sort of K through 12 level, because I think that that's where the education should happen and needs to happen, right? And I think one way to do that, and what I've demonstrated in the latter part of the talk, is really to emphasize the interconnections of violence, right? And to, rather than do this as, this is this group's experience or this is this group's experience, to really do it thematically, right? What is state violence? What is policing? What is US militarism? And so, and then see the ways in which all of our communities are connected to those institutions of violence, and embroiled in them, right? And the way in which some of our communities still continue to perpetuate them, but ultimately that doing the work of violence creates more violence, right? And it creates more violence for our communities, and then for families. And so one thing that I want to do is to really sort of think about how do we teach it in this way, so that we don't get into our silos of this is this group's experience, this is this other group's experience, and then we don't see how we're connected.
Thank you. Other folks, questions, comments? Oh, okay. So in the chat, Ma, Dr. Pirtle says, so many important connections and solidarities here. Thank you for your book and presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Pirtle and Dr. Payan. Oh, no, do you wanna?
Yeah, so so I shared with Dr. Vang, so you opened the book on an experience, and it put me really in a very reflective mode around cultural artifacts. And because of that forced migration, people needed to pack, right? And the importance of the, again, the cultural artifacts, the dress, and being forced, right? And just, it really put me in this reflection mode of the immigration story of my own family, right? Of not knowing the language, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to make that comment of starting that conversation with my own family, right? We don't talk about our immigration story enough. And for me, I'm all about that oral history. But just wanted to say thank you for that. Yeah, like I'm still reflecting about it, because again, we just don't talk about it, right? Because yeah, there's this notion of being in America, right? And what that means, and again, the different migration stories. And just the appreciation, and the story also leads, sorry if I'm giving too much, but you all need to get the book. But really, when one loses those cultural artifacts, right? Because it is that ownership, and it's part of the identity, right, of that family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. Part of, so I opened the introduction to the book with an image and then a narrative of a discussion of an artifact that I saw in the sort of refugee archives, right? And so it's actually, and that image is my own duplication, because I could not, typically when you go to an archive, you could take a picture, right? You could take pictures. And so I couldn't, because this archive is considered a sensitive archive because it's full of refugee resettlement records and applications. And so the idea is that many of the descendants of these families are still living, right? And so any kind of duplication would would really would be a violation of that. And so I didn't take a picture of it, but I saw the form. It was a half sheet of a missing baggage claim form, right? Many of us have experienced that.
Yeah.
We traveled and lost a luggage, and we had to go and, declare the loss, right? Through this form, completing this form. And then you have to list, what were the items and their values. And so this was a missing baggage claim form of a Hmong refugee family in their movement on their flight from Thailand to the US via Okinawa, San Francisco, and then to Minneapolis. And so and so in this form, they listed all of the sort of Hmong clothing items and jewelry, like what they managed to salvage on the earlier flight from Laos to Thailand, right? And then their value. And so I read that, I call it the lost baggage, right? Both as a way to gesture toward the baggage as US imperialist baggage, right? And then to gesture toward Hmong history as being lost, right? And so and then that loss, so the bag, it's a trace these other losses, right? So both losing family members, losing history, and what that, how does that open a way to think about narratives of migration and forced migration in particular, and how do we attend to the intricacies of all of that. And so I didn't want it. It's a story about state secrecy and U.S. empire and U.S. militarism, but I didn't want to start with that, right? I wanted to start with the narratives and the stories, and so that's where I went with showcasing this and discussing this missing baggage form, and the ways in which I'm trying to theorize history on the run as that Hmong refugee epistemology, right? And history on the run as histories that run, because they're carried by people who have been on the run, and that histories that run cannot be archived, right? I couldn't find them in the archive, obviously, and they are always unfolding, and they are fugitive, right? And so how I think about sort of fugitivity, I'm also drawing from Black Studies scholarship on fugitivity, right? To look at the ways in which we can imbue these histories with power.
Yeah, great. And then this will be our last question from Dr. Tanya Golach-Boza. What are some methods and strategies that you use in your work that ensure you avoid the pitfalls that Padiman falls into?
Thanks for that. It is, I would say that the key thing that I do is the book is not a first writing. The book is a second and third writing. So what I see in Fadiman's book is the ways in which she documents Hmong lives, both, in these very sort of racial colonial ways, right? So that's, and in these paternalistic ways. And so the use of language is important. And then the ways in which, in the writing, to not merely report, right? So Fadiman went and interviewed a bunch of people, both Hmong people, the family, and the doctors. And then she, reported what they said. And if you read in her preface or introduction, like it's actually a story of, The Spirit Catches You is a story about Anne Fadiman herself, as someone who is discovering and learning about health inequities, and about a strange group of people who are, quote unquote, being non-compliant to Western medicine, right? And who are contributing to their daughter's health decline, right? And so what I do, my work is not in direct conversation with Fadiman, but I do the work that Fadiman couldn't do, which is to provide the broader historical context, and to provide and to connect it to structures of violence, right? And then we can think about how Hmong people do not comply, right? And so that it is not about them not complying, right? It's about them being situated in a way where their stories and their narratives and their perspectives are not being listened to. So if you read in the Fadiman text, the parents of Leah Lee, the child who had epilepsy, were treated as children. And the ways in which the doctors knowledge was privileged over that of the family and other community members, right? And so I think that it takes a broader understanding of the context. It takes, I think that we can deploy similar methods in terms of, archival work, interviews, but, how do we understand and situate that information without merely reporting on it, right? We must interpret them.
Great, thank you. I know we're at time, and again, thank you, Dr. Vang, for this amazing presentation. And also, if there is a direct link that you would want to share for people to purchase the book, you can drop it in the chat, or you can send it to me. We will also be following up with an evaluation form to continue these virtual dialogues. The upcoming one is with our own Dr. Tini Matlock on April 22nd from 3 to 4. But again, thank you, Dr. Vang, for this opportunity and an amazing book. I can't wait to finish it. But again, thank you so much for everyone. And yeah, any last words for our team?
Thank you all.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Vang.
owner.
Thank you, everyone.